Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Killer Content and Context. What works to drive conversions on product pages? This is Steve Gershik, Chief Marketing Officer at InRiver, and I will be your host today. Today, we'll give an introduction of our speakers, briefly talk about InRiver, your host for this presentation. Then we'll dive in, first chatting about the power of context, and then on to product page best practices. As we're going through the webinar, please send questions in through the interface in front of you. Just click on the questions tab and you can type your question in at any time during the presentation today, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. If you are viewing this presentation on demand, you'll find my email address at the end. So please feel free to email any questions you may have about the content of today's talk, and I will follow up with you directly. So as mentioned, I'm Steve Gershik, CMO of InRiver. There's my background on the left side of your screen. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Sucharita Kodali, in just a few minutes. You can see our impressive histories on the screen in front of you. Sucharita is Vice President and Principal Analyst for Forrester, where she's an expert on e-commerce, omni-channel retail, consumer behavior, and trends in the online shopping space. So Sucharita, welcome. So for those of you who don't know InRiver, we're a leading provider of product information management solutions, PIM solutions. We help e-commerce marketers and merchandisers get control over their data and help them put quality content about their products into all of the selling channels that they care about. We've been focusing specifically on PIM for the past 11 years and work with B2C and B2B marketers around the world. In fact, more than 1,100 brands around the globe rely on InRiver's Product Marketing Cloud, which helps you onboard and enrich and plan your product releases and syndicate content and publish to all of the channels that you really care about. At InRiver, one of the most effective things that we see our customers do is really leverage context on product pages. And this might mean a clothing brand showing a piece of clothing as part of a full look, or making sure a customer sees only the iPhone cases that fit their specific phone and corresponding gear that supports that version of the phone. This is important because proper context ensures that the buyer gets content that's relevant to them, and that's what they're looking for. I'll walk you through a short example of how Ethan Allen, an InRiver customer, does this strategically across all of the platforms on which they sell. So Ethan Allen is about offering context to prompt the conversation. This is from the homepage. The furniture sales online, it's not just about selling sticks and cloth furniture. It's a lifestyle brand. It's a setting. It's a feeling used to engage the buyer. They draw the consumer into the experience and create an emotional connection, not just to a chair or to a table, but to a scene in which the buyer themselves is the star. Showing the furniture in the context of the room enables the buyer to drill down to specific pieces to understand details in context. The shopper can see the whole room and pick and choose what they'd like to learn more about, whether it's the material or the color, the fabric, the texture, how it looks in a certain light, and what pieces create this harmonious experience that resonates with a particular buyer. Drilling down shows many details. You can zoom, there's pricing, dimensions, shipping details, finishes, and again, it's all about context in the image. The full product details are available that enable the buyer to create confidence that what they're buying meets their needs precisely. All of this sums up to a helpful, relevant experience for your customer. This is critical for Ethan Allen's brand experience, and of course, that all-important conversion that drives sales. Before I introduce Sucharita, I do want to call out, because this just happened, the passing of a great American brand, or the transition of a great American brand, Sears, which more than a century ago pioneered the strategy of selling everything to everyone, filed for bankruptcy. And it still may convince creditors to let them restructure the company rather than liquidate, but it doesn't look very good. Now, here's a company that started out selling reliable watches to railroad workers in the late 1800s and expanded into a mail order business with catalogs that often exceeded 1,000 pages. Now, on the right is what their merchandising in their stores has looked like of late. It seems like a clearance center. Nothing is presented in context. And this is a real prime example of selection versus product merchandising, what we saw in the Ethan Allen examples. In the story I read in the New York Times about Sears, this quote stuck out for me. There's a quote that when you're in the retail business, it's all about newness. But Sears stopped innovating. So let this be a lesson for all of us. What was once a giant in the realm of commerce is now doomed to irrelevance. So setting the context and the scene for this presentation, let me introduce Sucharita, who is going to talk to you about creating killer content on your product pages.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. For those of you who may not be familiar with Forrester Research, Forrester is a technology research and advisory firm. It's headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and analysts like myself are part of the company helping our clients, who are often 1B plus companies, in their technology evolutions and their digital strategies. I specifically focus on e-commerce, retail, and cross-channel retail opportunities. And a lot of what we do at Forrester is also market research with consumers, consumers as well as retailers. And what I'll share with you in this presentation are some of the data points that we've collected in the last year on how consumers specifically are leveraging product detail pages and what is the type of content that they find most valuable. I don't think that you'll necessarily find a lot of the high-level findings shocking, as many of these have become industry standards, but I do think it's important to consider and really audit whether or not this is the kind of information that you have on your site, and to understand the gravity and the importance that it holds for customers. We actually asked consumers in a survey, what were the elements of a product detail page that they found most valuable. The item that they said was the most valuable, and the one that they used with the greatest frequency, was interestingly not product information, which we will get to, but the estimated time of arrival, or the overall availability of the item. 84% of customers actually said they wanted to know when a product would actually be arriving. Now, I think that it will come as no shock to anyone when we see that the example that I want to cite here is Amazon, because they have really set the standard on setting expectations around delivery and creating transparency to the shopper on that information when you're adding an item to cart, and then of course communicating that information at different points as well, whether it's on the checkout page or in subsequent post-transaction communication as well. So just really recognizing everything from exposing when the product will ship to when the product will actually be expected to arrive, to provide a specific date where possible. If those dates change, to give customers an update on those changes. One of the places where more retailers will lose customers than just about any is when there is a long delay, longer than expected. For instance, when there is a cancellation of a transaction because an item's out of stock or an item has been back ordered or your inventory information may not be accurate. So to the degree that you have the visibility and you are able to communicate that, that is not only a gold standard, but it's something that consumers expect. And when I get asked, what is it about Amazon that allows them to grow at the pace that they've been growing? There are any number of reasons, but one of them I will definitely argue is absolutely what this data has surfaced, which is that they have a pretty darn good handle on when virtually all of the 200 million plus items that are on their site will ship, and when they will ultimately show up at a consumer's doorstep. And they go to great pains to ensure that what actually arrives and when it arrives is as closely aligned to the promise that they've given customers. That is a tall order. I know that most companies don't even have that capability, but that's why investing in that type of supply chain visibility is so critical. Another example from an availability standpoint that I think is important to call out is it includes sites like Home Depot or Lowe's, where they do have the ability to actually showcase where in a store a particular item may actually be. Now, slightly behind the availability of the item and the timing of it is robust product information and visualization. And they're two slightly different things. Product information typically involves the text on the page, and visualization usually involves imagery. But we see that 81% of customers are users of product information, 69% are users of visualization tools. I wanted to share with you a few examples of sites that I think are interesting in their execution of these specific elements, and may give you a little bit of food for thought if you are considering any type of a product detail page redesign, or are considering different approaches to the design of your site as you refresh the content that's available. This is actually a screenshot from Allbirds, a couple of screenshots actually from Allbirds, which became, I think, one of the most recently anointed companies into the Unicorn Club. I think its latest fundraising round valued the company at more than $1 billion. But one of the things that is interesting is that it is a digitally native brand where many of the consumers are millennials and younger customers who are often completing transactions on mobile devices, and certainly a significant part of where they have generated energy is through word of mouth, and consumers just simply often having seen other people wear the products and deciding to complete the transaction immediately. What's interesting is that the content that actually describes the shoes is a bit below the fold, and it is very extensive, and certainly they showcase all of those elements, both from a text standpoint and an imagery standpoint, that consumers want, and the more is always the better. But the interesting piece is where they choose to showcase that, which is a little bit further down on the page in the red circle here, which I'm sorry, it didn't show up, but it's basically a learn more link, and that learn more link is what goes to the content modules that you see on the left-hand side of the page. And what they're achieving when they do this is the ability to basically serve two segments of customers. One segment are those customers who are basically spearfishing for an Allbirds SKU, and simply they know what they want. They're not going to investigate it further. They simply want to select their size, add it to cart, and complete checkout. The second type of segment is the consumer that is likely to be looking for more information. They may be further up the purchase funnel. They may not be as familiar with the Allbirds brand, and because of that, that information is just presented in a visually different context. I also think that there are opportunities to combine some of those elements of both the product information and the visualization. Iconography can sometimes do that, and it can break up and make the monotony of text look a little bit more appealing. Outdoor Voices is another player in the fashion space, which has gained a lot of attention and traction in the last few years. It is in the athleisure category, focusing on both men and women, more heavily focused on women. Its price points are a little bit lower than Lululemon, but some of the things that they have done are, in a relatively shallow SKU mix. This is not a site that's going to have thousands of items available for sale. They provide these icons, which are essentially shortcuts on what are the assets of each individual item in a very easily digestible and accessible way that allows shoppers to compare items in a streamlined fashion that really quickly communicate the pros and the other attributes of the item that a consumer may be looking for. So those are some of the examples from certainly the fashion industry. I also think that some of the best examples of strong product detail pages and robust product information being showcased are on some of the electronic sites, particularly when you look at pages with higher ticket items like some of the HD TV pages on Best Buy. And in those cases, what we see are are more frequently than not buying guides. And what is unique, special, and important about a lot of this is that some of this content is actually pulled from manufacturer partners, from vendors, and third parties who are not only more in better positions of authority to provide that content, but B, can also reduce some of the costs of a retailer itself having to invest in creating this content. And a lot of the best manufacturers, especially for higher end products, are absolutely in a position to invest and distribute some of this very, very high quality content that can be anything from demonstrations of the product to buying guides, which are often extensive visuals and text-based descriptions that can help shoppers navigate through a shopping experience. We know that more consumers than ever are eager to serve themselves. While store associates are still important, particularly for high ticket items, we do find that consumers are often doing a lot of research at home or on their own devices ahead of time. And this is the kind of rich information that consumers seek. And the more that your site is a destination for that information or provides a breadth of that kind of information, and that you've actually enabled search engines to find this information on your site. These are all things that are important. Some of the things that are also important to consider, and I'm jumping a little bit back and forth between different types of products. We talked a bit in the apparel and the electronic sector. I'm going to go back to the apparel sector now. In some cases, the amount of content and the text may not really be that essential, and what some of the attributes are that are incredibly important for shoppers are elements like colors and things like zoom. And the things that are important to keep in mind with respect to attributes like color is particularly in categories like fashion, or that return rates in fashion tend to be very high, higher than for physical stores. For certain retailers, we've seen return rates be higher than 50%, which is an enormous cost that merchants have to incur. One of the biggest reasons that consumers, one of the biggest avoidance unavoidable reasons, I should say, that consumers return purchases is that the product may not look the way that it was rendered online. And that is why elements like product colors that may have thumbnails associated with them, and just very, very simple taxonomy and verbiage describing those items are incredibly important. Gone are the days of esoteric, descriptions of colors that companies like J. Crew used to use, like happiness, to describe, a shade of yellow. The more transparent, the more almost Crayola-like in the hue that one presents, the better. The main reason for that, of course, being that a lot of shopping is still happening on desktop devices. All of those devices have different screen resolutions, and they communicate colors in slightly different forms. And when they do that, the expectation that the consumer may have may be very different than what ultimately arrives. And the web, even with smartphones where there's less variability, but there's still differences, has not been able to match the superiority, actually, of even catalog shopping, where colors are more precisely rendered than online. This is just another example on the Patagonia site, where it's not thumbnails, but it's little swatches. And again, the idea is to try to be as transparent as possible with describing the elements that often have very subjective qualities or imprecise qualities associated with them. Outfitting within fashion is also something that has a tremendous upside, because it is something that can scale relatively easily. These are technologies that can be pulled together with all of the machine learning that retailers are excited to talk about. This is a really, really good use of machine learning technology that can leverage everything from what people are buying together to even taking some data points from your own merchants on what could be a great outfit. But this idea of bundling is something that extends beyond just soft goods. It really can apply to hard goods and virtually every product category, especially if there are interesting accessory products or even cross-sell products that can create a package for shoppers. We don't see this all that often. We do see product recommendations, but the idea of pulling things together in a way that you may not have thought about is something that we don't see retailers doing with that much frequency, and consumers often do appreciate that. I would argue that kind of pulling ideas together are some of the biggest reasons that companies, the visual discovery engines like Instagram, Pinterest, Houzz, have succeeded to the degree that they have, is that they've stepped into that outfitting and bundling zone that no retailer had managed to do, and that magazines were too infrequent with doing. Zoom, not surprisingly, is an industry standard. The one piece that I want to say, because this is something that is so commonplace at this point, is that consumers actually prefer being able to scroll over an image, because 77% of them said they want to avoid new clicks. So the ability to provide that greater detail on that same page without forcing somebody to go to another page that then may have some lag in its download time, and then having to go back to the page you were on previously in order to actually purchase the item or go search for something else, is very, very onerous. So this notion of being able to showcase as much information as possible without having to click further is something that is extremely attractive to shoppers. And if you don't have it on your website, that is something that you should absolutely put on your roadmap. I also encourage companies to also have more images rather than fewer images. Lifestyle and on white backgrounds are all welcome, different angles, as much visibility into different points of view, whether it's an image that is taken from a straight on angle, a cross-sectional angle, a top angle, a side view. All of these are incredibly important for consumers to be making their decisions. That's part of why I'll share with you some of the data points around video and how video can be extremely valuable if you can figure out a way to actually reduce some of the costs associated with video. Product recommendations are a feature on product detail pages that naturally have been around for a long time. Perhaps the most surprising thing to me was that the number of consumers who actually said that they liked product recommendations explicitly was lower than I would have suspected. 44% of consumers said that it's important and it can certainly add value, but it's not always essential. And I suspect that a large part of that is due to the fact that consumers have been trained to spearfish online. And usually when they're spearfishing, they want to just go in to a search results page, find what they're looking for, purchase it, and move on. And the product recommendation it doesn't always necessarily add value to the experience unless you're leisurely browsing and exploring and looking for something as you would, for instance, for a gift. Recommendations and bundles, we know, can improve conversion rates. I'm just really showcasing this more as sort of an illustration from Staples of just the industry standard that we see. But if anything, what we're seeing more of is opportunities to enrich recommendations and to use them to your advantage. So it's not just a trade-off between one product and another, or encouraging people to just spend time on a site without necessarily seeing any ROI associated with it. So some of the places where we have seen value being added by looking at additional data points, and this is when we're talking about, again, some of these elements like machine learning or big data, there are a lot of ways that one can leverage the data points that you've collected already to improve things like product recommendation engines. One is to look at a product's return rates and to weigh that into whether or not certain products may be featured even as a recommendation. Taking inventory levels and margin into account. That's probably, one of the most important things to consider is wherever possible and given a choice between different recommendations to feature the ones that have more margin associated with them. And the other piece that is important to keep in mind is to understand the shopper's state of mind. In some cases, a shopper may want a specific item and may want alternatives to that specific item, either a higher ticket purchase or a lower ticket purchase in some cases as well, although it's really hard to measure the ROI when there is a lower ticket purchase that a consumer is ultimately driven to as a result of your recommendation engine. But really there is a delta between, does the consumer want that particular category and that's where they're in the state of mind to transact, or are they also looking for a bundle? Or are they looking for other accessories and other elements to help augment the purchase or to make the most of that purchase? So those are things that are just important to keep in mind. Video is also an area that consumers still haven't embraced as quite an industry standard. About a third of consumers say that it's important to them. So I'd argue that it's still emerging, even though it's been around for a while. But I would also say that that is the number that it is because it's not ubiquitous yet. It's not ubiquitous and it's not always optimized for different devices. But when companies are able to provide video, whether it is more lifestyle and explanatory video, the media companies, whether it's Apple or Netflix, are particularly good at that. But I also encourage companies to think more broadly about their usage of video. The beauty companies in particular have mastered this because this is just an example of some videos on the ColourPop page, and a lot of it is about how-to videos. And some of the beauty, no pun intended, of how-to videos is that the greatest part of their life is actually not on a retailer's website, but on YouTube, because one of the single biggest reasons that consumers search on YouTube is to learn how to do something. And beauty sites have discovered that YouTube videos are some of the biggest drivers of traffic back to their site, and a lot of it is through the non-commercial how-to videos that are featured either by ambassadors of a brand or vloggers or just other influencers who showcase that content. So I think that that's an important piece to consider, is that if there is some type of instructional content, if you're a home products manufacturer, or if you are in the cooking industry, or even in the fashion industry, there are great ways to showcase content on other third-party sites that can attract traffic and ultimately drive people back. More commonly, though, the way that we think of video is within a product detail page or on a retailer site, and much of it being much shorter in length and more functional from the standpoint of just purely displaying a 360-degree view of product. These are just some examples from Outdoor Voices and some of the verbiage around a model essentially talking and describing that product. And that's definitely one of the approaches. Zappos has had historically an approach of this nature, and it almost works like an infomercial where there is the product essentially being demonstrated and then being talked about. And it can be extremely influential because it is essentially a proxy for all of those multiple images and that photography that we talked about on the Wayfair page. But the other approach to video is more of the runway look, and it doesn't necessarily need any talking because a lot of the content can actually be communicated in text, either under the buy button or on the right-hand side of the screen. But the video essentially showcasing the product on a person and showing it in a 360-degree view with close-ups and shots that are taken from a further distance can all be incredibly valuable and helpful in showcasing the way that consumers may, kind of showcasing the product absent being able to touch and feel it. And just one of the highlights about the ASOS videos is that they have invested in video on virtually every product and on every product detail page. I know that's not a trivial investment. It can be expensive to do because you have to essentially weigh that into your creative flow. But it is something that, especially for a pure play like ASOS, is important to their brand. It's important to their conversion rate as well, because it does push people over the edge to see things that they may not have considered in the past. Another example here is from the Bellroy site, which is a phone accessories company. And I just want to point this out too from a video standpoint, because they have some video on their sites, is that, video doesn't help just aesthetic, categories like apparel and footwear. It can help categories as banal as cell phone covers as well. And there are some great advantages to that. You can actually have someone talk through the assets and the attributes of your product. You can showcase it through a clever video. And the beautiful thing about some of these types of goods as well is that they're not they're not vulnerable to the same vicissitudes of consumer demand as fashion is. In short, what I'm saying is that you take a video of some fashion item, and that video really only has a lifespan of maybe a few months because that's the lifespan of that item on a retail store, whereas the lifespan of something like a cell phone cover is much longer. I want to step back and talk about another attribute that often also gets a lot of attention, and that's ratings and reviews. 79% of shoppers say that they find ratings and reviews incredibly important, and I'm not going to go over the examples that are all old and tried and true, but I thought that what could be useful is to share some of the executions that you don't always see everywhere in retail. This is an example from Fabletics, where they provide more information than most review sites. One example on the left-hand side, which I thought was interesting, is that they actually do a survey of consumers who own that product and showcase the results of that survey. And then on the right-hand side, probably you've seen more of this kind of content, but people who are providing commentary and what's their usual size, or what's the size of the product that they purchased, which specific color did they purchase, and to provide that insight, because some of that detail could also influence how you as a future customer may read that particular content. The integrity of the reviews matter, but you also want to be very relevant. And one of the things that Sephora does that I think is important is, like on the previous page with Fabletics, if you want to filter for everybody who purchased a medium size of that SKU, you can do that. In the case of beauty, where there are other elements that make customers like you, it's not always the size, for instance, because size isn't relevant in most beauty products, but what is relevant are features like, whether a product is suited to people with certain skin tones, or whether it's suited to people with really sensitive skin or oily skin. And based on those attributes that Sephora has from some information they're collecting from you in a membership program, they are able to match the feedback from other similar customers as well. So basically, the takeaway is, to the degree that you can help filter those reviews in a manner that's relevant to you, the better. And I would argue that not even Amazon does a good job doing that. The one challenge here is, of course, getting volume of reviews. And that's always a challenge, but often with incentive programs, gamification, and just simply communicating to customers that you'd like a review is often a good way to gather those reviews. It's it's a process that with relatively few clicks can be executed in a relatively short period of time, and can be done from anywhere. And the more that your user interface enables that, the more likely you are to get more reviews. I thought that it would be useful. This is just data that we had collected this time last year, and we'll have the updated information probably in a few weeks. But this is still relatively timely and pertinent. And what we see are some of the things, some of the attitudes that consumers have about reviews. And some of the places where I want to just draw your eye to is at the bottom of the page, which is that a not insignificant percent of consumers say that they actually do look at the volume of reviews. They look at the number of times a product has been reviewed. Because that does help them. More data gives them more confidence in a decision on whether or not to purchase something. And the other piece is the last point, which is that there are a lot of people that use reviews both for big items as well as everyday items. And I thought that was just important, that there's a whole range of items that can benefit from this. I think that we have a bias that more expensive items online are the ones that are going to benefit the most, but there are are a lot of consumers that also will use reviews for their benefit for lower ticket items too. The last bit, which ties somewhat into the first point about availability, is real-time inventory information. And this is something that's also very, very important to customers, where 79% of shoppers want to know what inventory is available in local stores. I thought that I would just share with you a screenshot from Home Depot. I think there are very few companies that do as good of a job as Home Depot does on its product detail page. And what I like about what it does is that it is able to auto sense what is the closest store to you if you're accessing the site or the app or its content from the United States. But what it does is that it will actually tell you the number of units of that product that are in stock and where specifically in the store, down to an aisle and a bay, that particular product is located. And then if you actually go into the store, there's usually a store map that you can access on your mobile device that will roughly lay out, where in the store that particular section is relative to the entrance that you walked into. So it's a brilliant execution. It's seemingly it's super easy to use from a customer standpoint, and it's seemingly easy to execute, but it is incredibly difficult to pull off because most companies don't have this level of detail for their store maps, and more importantly, their inventory levels don't always have such a great level of integrity. So the last piece of content that I just wanted to share are other considerations in the product detail page. And in addition to customer ratings and reviews, we also find that consumers also have a great proclivity and an interest in professional ratings and reviews. These are obviously more expensive to procure because you usually have to pay for a professional review, but it can be extremely helpful to customers. And in a world where there are often there's a lot of fake news. There are a lot of questions around the integrity of a lot of reviews. Professional reviews can bridge that gap and can lend more authenticity to what's being said about a product. And also another consideration is that all professional reviews need not always be written by journalists or professional product evaluators like somebody from Consumer Reports. It can be consumers that have volunteered to evaluate products and are willing to write reviews in exchange for being able to test a product or in exchange for other coupons or whatnot, so long as you are transparent about exposing who that, kind of what that trade-off was, and that reviewer is generally pretty good about providing useful information. Another piece that is incredibly important on product detail pages, which I didn't spend a lot of time talking about, but is very, very important, are search attributes that usually show up along the top navigation or along the left-hand navigation. And some of the best sites that do it well are some of the home improvement sites, like whether it's a build.com or a Wayfair or even a House, where they have very, very deep product catalogs and specific subcategories like kitchen knobs for your cabinets, and the ability to really refine the search results based on attributes that are really relevant to that subcategory are top notch. And that's what you want to make sure that you've considered is, what are, for down to various categories and subcategories, are you making search results as useful as you can for shoppers, particularly if you have a very, very deep product catalog. It's less relevant if you have a shallow product catalog, in which case I'd probably spend more time investing in videos. But for those deep product catalogs, those search attributes and the intelligence and the taxonomy that you have is really important. Comparison tools for big ticket purchases. You'll often see this on automotive websites where there may be different makes or models of cars, and it's sometimes difficult to understand what are the differences, but to have some of those standard standard attributes where there may be a handful of elements that can be easily compared on, one screen is it can often be very, very valuable for shoppers. And I would encourage this really only in the cases of commodities or higher ticket purchases where consumers may be kind of considering between purchase A or purchase B. You want also alternative options for out of stocks. Often retailers don't have products that they should be selling in stock. And the more that you have other things that consumers may want to buy or other suggestions, that is something that shoppers value. Otherwise, what typically will happen will be that the consumer will go back to Google or to Amazon and basically execute, or sometimes eBay. eBay is often a search engine of last resort, and they will go and see if they can find whatever they may be looking for on some of these other websites. Live chat can often be very helpful for shoppers as well, although that's by no stretch of the imagination something that every consumer uses or wants. But the value is often, particularly when consumers may be challenged with completing a transaction, for instance, or they may be experiencing a glitch on a particular page. The great irony of chat is that consumers do want to use chat 24/7, and a lot of commerce companies still don't provide 24/7 chat capabilities. So that we still have to struggle with how do you provide that all hours customer service. Consumers are often using digital commerce tools in those off hours. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. And then the last consideration is just sharing with friends. Consumers often do, from a product detail page or at the end of a transaction, will want to share a product on a social network page, or will want to send an email to a close friend or a family member to let them know that they've purchased something. So with that, I am going to give the virtual mic back to Steve, who will moderate a brief Q&A in the moments that we have left. And for those of you who may be interested in the content, or have any questions about the content, our contact information is here.
Thank you so much. I'm just finishing up notes. That last slide had me scribbling furiously on here. I do have to say the power of brand is pervasive, and I cite as evidence last night as I was looking through your slides. I reminded myself how much I love Allbirds shoes, and so within 5 minutes of finishing looking at your slides, I made another purchase. So when I get home, I'll have a brand new pair of Allbirds shoes, which I absolutely love, and fully agree with your notion of word of mouth being so powerful in their case. All right, we've got a few minutes left here, and there's a questions tab in your webinar interface. Feel free to type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. If your question is really specific to your particular situation, we'll make note of it. We may not read it out during the webinar, but we will certainly respond back to you. And again, if you're listening to the on-demand version of the webinar, then there's my email address right there, or you can tweet at me at InRiverSteve, and we'll get you an answer to your question. A question about professional reviews. You were talking about professional reviews, Sucharita, and what do you define as professional reviews? It seems like it starts to get blurry when you're talking about professional consumer reviewers as opposed to professional full-time reviewers. So how do you make that distinction?
I think that there's probably a continuum, and on the one hand, you'll have just one-off consumer reviews on one extreme, and then you would have extremely professional, unbiased reviews on the other extreme, like consumer reports. And I think that in the middle, there's a hybrid. There are people who may be consumers, but they also, spend a lot of time writing reviews because they may have some interest in doing that. That is, a way that they pass time. In some cases, they may be incented to do it, but they are able to provide more of the clinical detail that you would normally get from a really professional reviewer. But if you don't have the resources, or really even the moral authority to provide that, to have that hybrid, type of consumer, basically, kind of cheap freelancers is really what we're talking about to write these reviews for you. That's another approach. What we find, unfortunately, is that consumers aren't, as we've learned in this era of fake news and BuzzFeed, that consumers don't really distinguish that much in the source of the information. What is important is that, there's credible, that to the degree, you want to try to provide the credible information, and you want to make sure that it's well written and that it reinforces the pros and the cons of the honest pros and the cons of a product. You don't get very far as a company by creating lies in your ratings and reviews. Consumers quickly lose trust. But what I'm saying is, if you can leverage those you can leverage other people to create honest content. Even those who may not necessarily be the customers who purchase your products, it's a worthwhile endeavor to chase that down.
This is a really interesting question, and it occurred to me when you talked about all the variety of different things you can have on the product page. It seems like a lot of these ideas add complexity. How do you make that manageable within your firm, dealing with complexity?
Well, I don't know that that anyone's found a great answer. This is where strong content management systems, all of the content solutions, whether PIM systems or master data management systems, can be incredibly valuable to helping organize data that sits in disparate silos. But I think that much of the ultimate execution to the customer is based on great graphic design and clean graphic design, and then pulling in whatever you need to pull in order to achieve the goals, in order to execute what that graphic design has laid out. I think that the great trick is that most of these slides are showing incredibly complex data sets that they've synthesized into really streamlined ways of presenting data. And there's, obviously a lot of editing, and there is, kind of presentation that kind of is user friendly, and there's a lot of translation of messy content on the back end that comes to what's ultimately showcased to customers. But that's all the hard work of e-commerce is kind of doing exactly that.
Let's see, we've got time for a few more questions. Elisa writes in and says, if the website only has functionality for one area of text, I guess if it only has room for one area of text, is it better to do bullet point text points or short description copy, more romance copy? Which kinds of descriptions convert?
I don't know that there's a universal answer. You have to test it and see if different customers respond differently. If you were to look at, the readers of sites like Groupon or J. Peterman, the expectation is that some of the content is going to have some wit or some unique brand kind of value or branding kind of integrated into what's there, a tone. And in other cases, consumers just straight up want bullets because bullets are easier to digest. And I would probably say that for most companies, bullets probably are easier to communicate, especially if you don't really have a brand voice and you're selling more commoditized products. But if you do have a special brand voice, the wit in writing can sometimes be a unique attribute.
This is interesting. What content aspects should be considered differently in the grocery perishable category? This is from Christine.
In grocery, it tends to be more about kind of very specific attributes that people may be searching for, like dimensions, kind of ingredients, whether or not something has allergens. In a perfect world for perishables, if you can provide some kind of qualitative rating of kind of how sweet the fruits are, or kind of how ripe kind of a vegetable is, or kind of how fresh it may seem, like that can be valuable from a digital commerce standpoint. But things like ratings and reviews are probably less useful for a lot of commodities and groceries. It's more kind of those specific items that consumers could be looking for a particular product for. And one aspect that we hear less of, but is a possibility for greater engagement on grocery sites is meal inspiration, and that's something that very, very few grocers do well, but that's like one of the biggest use cases of a site like Pinterest is, it helps to solve the what's for dinner problem. And if you can engage people, on a product detail page and, give them, 5 easy recipe ideas with this particular ingredient that they're purchasing, that's something that digital can accomplish that physical stores rarely do.
You were talking about live chat on site, and a lot of our customers at InRiver are starting to look at AI and using chatbots to provide product information because they can't staff a live chat function 24/7. What other types of innovations are you seeing coming down the line, if you peer into your crystal ball, that will have an effect on product pages?
That's a good question. There's a lot of talk about voice ordering and voice functionality. I'm not super bullish on it because it's still, a tertiary use case at this moment in time. But I think that, I'm going to make a call that we may be experiencing kind of a maturation of the product detail page, at some point. Like, how much better could it possibly be? Like, we just need to make sure it doesn't get worse by having, kind of bad reviews, completely sully the reputation of e-commerce sellers. But, as long as you have images and you describe the product and you let people who purchase the product leave their feedback on it, I don't even know what more could possibly happen. I think anything else could almost be solutions looking for problems and could be over engineering, kind of value there. So I would argue that, I don't know that there's that much more. I mean, maybe we could, leverage more, kind of imagery from social networks to inspire people to figure out new ways to use or merchandise items. But I don't think that, we're that far from the perfect product detail page. I think that, there are a lot of pretty good ones already out there.
There's your tweetable moment, folks. You heard it here. Sucharita Kadali from Forrester says, we may be approaching peak product information. We've taken about as far as it can go. Sucharita, thank you so much for joining us here today. You shared so many insights with us. If people want to read more of your writing, do you have a blog available, someplace they can follow you?
Twitter is probably the best place because I do, put a lot of links to things that I've written or that I think are worth reading. And that my Twitter handle is here on this page.
Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us, Sucharita, and thank you everybody for your kind attention. We present these webinars to help you achieve your business goals. So if you have any feedback or suggestions for future topics you'd like us to present on, my email address is right there on your screen, steve.gershik@inriver.com, or tweet at me at inriversteve. This concludes the live webinar. It will be available on demand, so you can go back and review the great information that was shared here today. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Goodbye.
Thanks, Steve.